And here we go. Over to you, Andy.
Marvelous. Thanks, Nigel. And good evening, everybody. I lived in Bristol for about 18 years or so. I went there for university, and actually in the last 6 years I've moved to the Forest of Dean. So not only am I talking to you as someone who knows the forest, but I also live here in the forest as well. So I hope it's going to be an enlightening evening. I'm just going to share my screen. I'm going to share the sound because I want to make sure that you can hear some of the things that I've got. And you should then see what I've got, hopefully. And I'm just going to go to the beginning. There we are. So this will just come through. So as Nigel says, I have the privilege really of being able to show people wildlife, really, particularly around the Bristol region, but also now here in the Forest of Dean. And I've just got back actually from taking 4 people, 2 from Gloucester and 2 from Aberdeen, where I think you're off to, Nigel, out looking for wildlife this evening. And it was certainly very beautiful and autumnal and peaceful this evening. So what I'd like to do over the next hour or so is to tell you a little bit more about the wildlife of the Forest of Dean, but also what I'm going to do is tell it as a bit of a story, really. I'm going to introduce it in terms of where it is, a little bit of history about it, but then also start off with the small stuff, start off with kind of the soil, some of the invertebrates, and then sort of work our way up to some of the kind of the bigger wildlife to give you that kind of sense, really, I guess, of how everything kind of fits together. So I hope that makes for an interesting presentation tonight. And of course, one of the starbirds of the Forest of Dean that people often come to see is the hawfinch there on the front cover. All right, so where is the Forest of Dean? Well, I tried to sort of get Anglesey and Bangor right on the sort of top west side of the map there. And you can see that we're just down south on the north side of the Severn Estuary, where there's the red spot, and very close to the Welsh border. And in fact, many of the populations of birds, such as the pied flycatcher, breeding curlew, which I don't think are breeding anymore, are thought to actually come from some of the breeding populations in South Wales, rather than from some of the breeding populations from the sort of more English regions. And if we zoom in, Forest of Dean pretty much in the middle of the picture there, we can see that actually we're not too far away from the River Severn at all. We're at higher altitude though, so the Forest of Dean, certainly where I am, is one of the highest points in the Forest of Dean, close to Ruadine Hill, which is about 200 meters above sea level. And you can just see sort of northwest of where it says Forest of Dean, you've got Simmons Yacht, which is, and that whole area there is the Wye Valley. Very beautiful gorge and valley, home to lots of different species of wildlife, in particular the sort of plant life. And here we are now, bang, looking at the middle of the Forest of Dean. Now, the widest area of the Forest of Dean is about 100 miles square, and known as the sort of hundredth of St Breville's. But the main forest, the main kind of forested green bits with all the trees that you can see, is around about 40 miles square. And where it says Speech House, that's one of kind of the oldest bits of the forest, with a very old hotel, where back in the day there would have been verderers, people that were sort of taking care of the wild animals, the boar and the deer that would have been shot, and they were sort of they used to have their own verderers court, where people would have gone to if they were found to be taking animals that they shouldn't have been taking, what have you. Canop, you might see the word Canop there, just to the left of the Forest of Dean. That's an important place for some ponds, which I'll be showing you a little bit later. And down towards the bottom central of the picture, you'll see the word Park End. That's a little village which is very close to the RSPB's Nags Head Reserve. And I actually live on the north side where it says Nail Bridge, right towards the top middle of the picture, Nail Bridge. That's where I live, right at the very top edge there. So the Forest of Dean is actually in a valley. So you've got 2 very high sides of the valley, like where I am, and actually the area of Canop and Park End is in the bottom of that valley, and it certainly gets very cold there in the winter. It's the coldest part of the forest. Now, we call it the Forest today. It's managed by Forestry England and has been since the early 1900s. But actually, if we go back to the 16, 17, 1800s, the Forest of Dean was in fact a very open landscape. So we have to go back even further to find it as a really kind of intense kind of forest, back to the days when William the Conqueror would have come to the Forest of Dean to hunt animals. He would have been based in Gloucester and came across via Gloucester into the forest to hunt various animals. But in the 16, 17, 1800s, it was a very open landscape. And that's because there was coal mining, such as this colliery here at New Fancy. And some of you, if you have been to the Forest of Dean, may know New Fancy View. And it's a very good place looking for displaying goshawk in the springtime. It was also a very open landscape because there was lots of iron ore being mined, and also much of the woodland was being used to make charcoal, which was used in the iron foundries. And many of the oak trees were cut down, not necessarily for the shipping industry, but their bark was used in the tanning industry, because the tannins that's in the bark of the oak trees were used to soften the leather. So really, it was a very open forest woodland landscape. Lots of it would have been woodland pasture. And it's really only in the last 100 years or so that the forest has really become a mixture of broadleafed and coniferous woodland. So when Forestry England, then Forestry Commission, took over the Forest of Dean, and very much it's public land. It's a fantastic place to go exploring, because you're not constantly being assigned to small footpaths with keep out private land. You can explore all the different tracks and pathways in a very free way, which is wonderful. And Forestry England manage the forest for trees, for timber, to make money. They manage it for recreation, for cycling, for Go Ape, where you can go up high into the treetops on sort of adventurous play areas for adults and children, and also for wildlife. But one of the consequences of the timber industry that Forestry England had with the Forest of Dean is that back in the day, in the 1900s, lots and lots of the oak and beech broadleaf woodland got cut down and was replaced with a lot of coniferous woodland, larch and Douglas fir, Norway spruce, and Scots pine. A lot of local people don't like that at all. And certainly over the last few decades, there's been a more concerted effort from Forestry England to get a better balance, kind of half and half, of both broadleaf and coniferous woodland in areas that have been clear felled. And their 100-year plan is moving away from a clear fell model. It's moving towards a more sympathetic model that's doing more strip removal of trees, and also doing more kind of thinning out of trees. There's a fabulous document, My Shared Forest, which you can look up online, and it really goes into a lot of detail of how the 100-year plan is being more sympathetic to the environment, to archaeology, to geology, to people, the soil and water, and so forth. And it's a very inspiring document that's been embraced by the forest and by the community. So when you're walking through the forest, one thing that's very unique about it is it's a real mosaic environment. So although you've got the commercial forestry there, there's been a deliberate move to make sure that it doesn't go on forever. There's not vast tracts of coniferous woodland and so forth. So when you're walking a couple of hours, maybe walking 2, 3, 4 kilometers or so, you're constantly moving in and out of different environments and different habitats, which of course is what wildlife loves. Wildlife loves lots of edge habitat. It loves lots of open spaces. There's bats that like very dense canopy woodland. There's bats that prefer very open woodland. And the same with birds. You've got birds like the Pied Flycatcher, and the Redstart and the Wood Warbler that prefer not much kind of herb and shrub layer. But then you've got other species that really want that. And there's a bit of everything throughout the Forest of Dean. And it's probably one reason why the Forest of Dean actually still has many of the species that would have once been common across lowland England and Wales, but have since been lost due to agricultural changes, intensification of farming, for example, urbanization, and the use of chemicals. And although the Forest of Dean isn't necessarily isolated from some of that, and certainly chemicals used in the countryside will still enter the Forest of Dean through aerosol, it's still buffered and it still has some protection from it. Now, this is looking a view from my home, or near my home anyway, looking towards the town of Cinderford, which is the big town in Forest of Dean, still relatively small to be honest. This is an area of recent clear fell, which quickly becomes home to tree pipits. Got very good populations of tree pipits in the Forest of Dean, nightjars, and also reptiles if they can get there. The problem reptiles have is that often there's bands of coniferous woodland in between places. So the Forest of Dean and the Forestry England is very conscious about creating corridors for butterflies, dragonflies, reptiles to get between some of these different environments. And in the northeast side of the forest, there's a huge area that had become forested and has been clear felled and is managed by the Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust as a heathland, an open kind of acidic grassland habitat. And you can just see some conservation grazing cows, some Aberdeen Angus cows here being used on and off, along with Exmoor ponies to actually help manage the site for things such as nightjars, stone chats and adders and different plants that are living here. And the Forest of Dean would have had many, many more open heathland areas back in the day, 200 years ago or so. When Forestry England took over, a lot of those areas became forested. So the RSPB, Forestry England, Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust, Woodland Trust are trying to ensure that there's, again, this mosaic of open environments that suits wildlife that once would have been even more common here at the Forest of Dean. So here's one of those cows doing some great conservation grazing. In amongst the forest, though, there are also many, many ponds and lakes. Most of these actually have been made by people around about 200 years ago. There are lots of natural brooks and running water through the Forest of Dean, but big ponds like Cannock ponds, which are actually reservoirs, were made about 200 years ago. And they were made to provide water for Park End, that was at a sort of is slightly downhill of the ponds, to provide water, to actually move a water wheel to pump the oxygen. It was to move the bellows, to pump air into the furnaces to melt down the iron ore. This was in the 1820s and it didn't really work very well. And by the time they'd actually built the ponds and started using them, mechanization and steam power was coming in, and so the ponds weren't really needed. But they are a fabulous legacy now, important ponds for many, many toads and newts and also water birds, crayfish, and other species of fish that live in here as well. But there's a lot of hidden archaeology. So wherever you go in the forest, there's signs of old tramways. Many of the cycle tracks are old railway lines. This is just on the other side of the road for me, from where there used to be the northern quarter colliery. And you've still got lots of the kind of mess, I guess, the spill tips that were left over from the coal industry. Incidentally, this area here is loved by the deer and the boar because not many people go in there. So there's a few boar wallows in here, which they love to use. There's also signs of people using the forest that goes back thousands of years. This is at Puzzlewood, for example, on the northwest side of the forest, where you've got signs of where people were removing iron ore up to 2,000 years ago when the Romans were here. What's left behind is amazing moss-clad, yew-clad rocks, really. And this actually is often used by Merlin and Doctor Who and Star Wars for filming because it creates such an incredible damp, mossy atmosphere. But these are just a few more pictures before we get onto the animals, just showing you the environment to understand how much of a mosaic is. This is in the spring. This is a reasonably young bit of oak woodland and beech woodland, not too far from the Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust resort, but actually very, very good place for spotting spotted flycatcher and redstarts. They love this particular bit of woodland here. And many parts of the Forest of Dean still have intact ancient woodland. If you look here, you can see there's 3 indicator species. We've got wood spurge, which is the tall lime green flower. We've got bluebells, we've got wood anemone, and there's many other types of ancient woodland indicator species throughout the Forest of Dean. Some of those areas obviously have been, many acres obviously have been damaged through forestry and mining over the years, but there are still many intact areas of ancient woodland present. And of course, when you look closely at these, you start to see life. Look here, for example, wood spurge is not necessarily the most colourful in terms of vibrant colours, but in my mind, it's got beautiful, beautiful lime green flowers, which in this case is very attracted to these tiny little flies here coming in to feed and hopefully contributing to some pollination in some way. And on the outskirts of the forest, we still have wild daffodils. Here's my little boy, Freddie, who's 5 now, walking through a fabulous area of ancient woodland with these wonderful wild daffodils. They've become very rare across the UK because they were over harvested back in the Victorian period particularly, but there is what we call the golden triangle just on the edge of the Forest of Dean, where many ancient woodlands still have these fabulous wild daffodils. And of course, particularly where you've got limestone areas, you'll also find lots of pollarded trees, lots of coppiced trees, many of them very old, ash, beech, some oak, as well as lime, and also lots of wild garlic as well. All right, so that hopefully just gives you a sense of the environment. It's not just a forest, it's a mosaic environment with lots of different sorts of woodland environments in it, with water, with different geology. It's got one of the most diverse kind of geological kind of cross sections you can imagine. But let's go to start with the soil first of all, because of course, if you have a healthy soil, just like in farming, you're going to have hopefully healthy woodlands. And one of the things that I'm so pleased about that we have here in the Forest of Dean are thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of dung beetles called door beetles. You see them all over the place. You know, how often is it these days, apart from maybe things like ants and honeybees, even less so honeybees, that you can say you can see something in abundance? But when you walk around the Forest of Dean, you see lots and lots of dung beetles. Again, you haven't got animals that are being given either nectings and anti-worming drugs. The poo, apart from your dog poo that might have been given some anti-worming drugs, you've generally got, you know, very good organic poo. And so the dung beetles love it. And what they do is they bury it underground, they lay their eggs in it, and then their larvae feed on it. Even this evening, we were still seeing lots of these. They have a long period that they're out between March and November. Each individual only lasts a few weeks or so. So you often see them on their backs dying and all squashed and things like that. But they have a long season. And they're great to see. My boys love picking up the dung beetles. And underneath, they're iridescent, probably used in some form of sexual selection, and the iridescence isn't necessarily visible to birds that would see the iridescence. It's underneath their bodies, and occasionally you see them flying, but not very often. So you can see here lots and lots of them gathering together here, and some of them having a little meeting, maybe a committee meeting or something like that here in the Forest of Dean. So really great to see these, because if you see lots of dung beetles, you know that you've got good healthy soils and good healthy layer at that particular part of the woodland level. What's also really important about the Forest of Dean is dead wood. So Forestry England are leaving lots more dead wood now. And if you go to the RSPB and the Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust woodlands, you'll see dead wood, standing dead wood and fallen dead wood. Both have a function in different ways for birds and fungi and beetles and bats. And this is a fabulous old, very old kind of pollarded beech in Nag's Head RSPB Reserve. All this rot creates great places and cavities for bats and fungi and beetles and bees. I think there was even perhaps a hornet nest in here. And then these incredible bracket fungi growing on the tree as well. And the tree itself is still half alive. It hasn't completely kind of lost all its food and water going up inside the bark there. But equally, it's providing an important place for wildlife. Now, the floral diversity in the Forest of Dean isn't necessarily high. If you go to the outskirts of the forest, you will still find lots of traditional meadows with lots and lots of orchids and bird's foot trefoil and knapweeds and many traditional kind of flowers. And as you head towards Gloucester, you'll still get yellow rattle in some of the meadows. In the forest itself, we're a bit more limited in the floral side of things, but ragwort is very important. It's demonized in the wider countryside for being a sort of pest plant when it comes to horses and cows, but really it's only an issue if it's in hay. If it's actually growing in a field, then horses particularly will eat around it. But here in the Forest of Dean, of course, we haven't got that worry. There's not really horses in the Forest of Dean, maybe just on the outskirts, a bit of horse riding. So ragwort's able to grow very well, and it's an important food plant for cinnabar moths. You can see their caterpillars at the top here, stripy, gatekeeper butterflies. And there's many other different sorts of particularly late summer flowering plants. Fleabane comes out, for example, lots of wild mints. And many of the edges of the tracks are damp, so they tend to attract plants that tend to like a little bit more of a damp environment. This is just outside my back garden. And again, if you look here, you can see lots and lots of tiny little hoverflies and solitary bee here and some tiny nettle moths and things like that. So lots and lots of different insects. And because a lot of the soil hasn't been improved, you've got, as I say, things like bird's foot trefoil, and here we've got a fabulous common blue butterfly. I hadn't seen many of these in recent years, but they are around, and isn't it stunning? A lovely male there. And one butterfly that the Forest of Dean is special for is the small pearl bordered. Now, this is declining in the Forest of Dean. It's thought to be because it's becoming more enclosed. We used to have 9,000 sheep before foot and mouth. Now we have maybe just a few hundred. And although sheep from a conservation perspective can be damaging to the environment, obviously in smaller densities and certain numbers, they can be beneficial. And they certainly used to be beneficial keeping parts of the forest more open, which rabbits also contributed towards, and they're not as common as they used to be. So there's less places now for the small pearl border butterfly. Plus the forest is drying out. It's not as wet as it used to be. But nonetheless, it's a good butterfly to be looking out for in June time, along with several other different sort of species of, what's the white one called? I can't remember the white and the rarer white one. But anyway, beautiful butterfly there. And in our garden, believe it or not, we do get dingy and grizzled skippers. We live next door to a quarry, an old quarry that's now managed by a vet who has dog walking there. And it's got lots of lovely open basking areas. We've got lots of wild strawberry. We've got lots of bird's foot trefoil, things that the grizzled skipper and the dingy skipper larvae like to eat. So I feel very privileged that we get them. And we even get a very rare bee fly called the heath bee fly, which lives in the quarry and comes across into our garden sometimes. Of course, lots of different moths, both common, probably unusual as well. I'm sort of, now the boys are getting old enough, just getting into doing a bit of moth trapping, but still learning my moths. But one of my favorites has got to be the buff-tipped moth, where it's replicating the tip of a branch, like a birch branch. Now, in this photograph, can you see a brimstone butterfly? This is a superb find. And you don't often see how the coloration and shape of a brimstone butterfly works. Well, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I'm just moving the cursor around where the brimstone butterfly is. And here's a close-up of it. Isn't that superb? Took this photograph, I think it was 2 years ago now, very close to Walgreens, where the Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust have their reserve. And I just couldn't believe how well camouflaged this brimstone butterfly was. Absolutely brilliant. And what we have lots of here in the Forest of Dean is alder buckthorn, which is the favorite food of the brimstone butterfly. Oh, its caterpillar. So we're moving up the invertebrates before we get to the birds, just showing you the kind of wealth of invertebrate life that there is, because of course, if you haven't got this, you haven't got your birds and all your other animals. There's lots of rich water bodies, and at the Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust's Wall Green Reserve, a mine was flooded, and now there's a fantastic big lake, which is, I think, one of the best places, certainly in the Forest of Dean and perhaps even the region, for dragonflies. I'm not going to see a rare dragonfly, but this one here is the broad-bodied chaser. Absolutely stunning. And there are lots of other little kind of pools in the acidic boggy grassland close to Walgreens that is host to a whole variety of different species of dragonflies. One of my favorites that you'll see at the RSPB's Nag's Head Reserve actually is this one, the emerald damselfly with the bright blue eyes and the iridescent green thorax and tail. And you can see them just in the grasses, just on the edge of the water in June and July. Absolutely stunning to have these close by. Now, another important animal for, I guess, aerating the soil and removing lots of different sort of pest insects. I don't like to use that word, but in effect, keeping different insect populations under control are wood ants. Now, you won't find wood ants in that many places. They're certainly on the west side of the east side of the forest. We've got a few of these, and in some of the more fragmented but kind of connected woodlands in the northeast of the forest. But there are certainly wood ants around, providing these incredibly well-domed nests that they have. And if you look here, you can see all the little wood ants moving. If you've ever put your hands on them, your hands then smell of vinegar because of the acetic acid that they sort of spray at you when they feel a little bit threatened. So with all this fantastic invertebrate life, of course, you're going to have the slightly bigger animals. And if you come to the Forest of Dean, in the evening time, certainly during the springtime, but throughout the year, one amphibian that you're certain to see is the toad. They're everywhere, lots and lots of toads. And certainly during the daytime, at the right time of the year, in June, July time, you can come across thousands of them across some of the cycle tracks, penny-sized toads as they're leaving the ponds after metamorphosing into little tiny toadlets. But lots and lots of toads around the forest. It's certainly the default amphibian if you're walking, and certainly at dusk time, they're often coming out, particularly if it's a little bit damp. Of course, there are also lots of small mammals here as well, your shrews, and we're very lucky here in my garden and that we actually get water shrews. We've got a 30-meter garden with a pond that we dug in 2017. We had a water shrew a couple of years ago, and this year we've had one, or we've actually had several. I think we've had a pregnant female who's had some young, and certainly the other week we had two calling up by the pond. And my office overlooks the pond, and you can actually hear them squeaking. They've got a much louder squeak than a common shrew. And then suddenly you see that the water shrew underwater. You can just see the aquatic vegetation moving around in the pond. So we've got lots and lots of different mammals. We get yellowneck mice here in the garden. But of course, you've got your common voles that are important food for owls, particularly tawny owls here in the Forest of Dean. And in this case, you've got the bank voles. And occasionally you do see them as well when you're walking around at dusk before it's getting too dark. You will sometimes spot bank voles scurrying around. But important food, not just for owls, but also snakes. So we don't have the rarer reptiles here in the forest. We don't have the smooth snake or the sand lizard, but we do have things like grass snakes, for example. We do have common lizards, and I'm very lucky that we get common lizards here in the garden, which is one of my most absolute. My wife always says if we'd known that we had lizards in the garden, we would never have visited the house 3 times. We would have just bought it, on the first visit. So we've got them both in the front garden and the back garden. They also use the nearby quarry. But actually throughout the forest, you'll find lizards. And even along some of the rides, where you've got a bit of woodland either side, but where you've got a little bit of bracken, they'll sometimes come out and bask on the bracken as well. So you can see them in some of the kind of more wooded areas where there's a bit of sunlight coming through, as well as in the more open areas. And this is in my garden, actually, where I've got some dead wood. And we get several sort of pregnant females in the springtime. They have these little black babies, which are growing at the moment now. We've seen 1 or 2 just the other day, actually, when we had a little bit of sunshine. And of course, adders as well. Now you don't see these very often. There's 1 or 2 spots where you can go where you might sometimes see them basking in the springtime. And New Fancy View, which is a well-known place for them, is a great place to go in the spring looking for goshawk. And as you're walking up towards the viewpoint, then along the fence line, you can sometimes see adders basking. But apart from that, don't tend to see them very often. But we do have lots of slow worms here in the forest as well. And you'll see those sometimes coming out more in the evening time. So that gives you an idea of hopefully the kind of middle ground stuff. So let's move on to some of the bird life that we have here in the Forest of Dean. And I'm sure just like in parts of North Wales and Northern England, you've got, where you've got those clean, fast flowing streams and rivers, you get your dipper. And here in the Forest of Dean, of course, there will be lots of aquatic invertebrates. The streams and the brooks here are reasonably clean. They do suffer from some sedimentation from the forestry practices where sediment gets into the water. Obviously, they're not immune to stuff coming off the roads and going into the water. But nonetheless, there are still lots and lots of dippers, both in the River Wye or the tributaries from the River Wye and also in the tributaries going through the Forest of Dean. And this one's a juvenile. You can see it's got a slightly more scaly breast and scaly back and what have you. And these are often very close to Cannock ponds where there's some fast flowing water coming down from the pond. And I love this photograph, lovely reflections. And you can see one of the adult dippers here. Looking for invertebrate life, dragonfly larvae, damselfly larvae, perhaps small fish that's underwater and swimming underwater, gripping underwater to get their food. What's really nice also is that when you look at some of our water birds that are declining and perhaps becoming amber listed in things like moorhen, little grebe, grey wagtail, dipper, kingfisher, I'm always very pleased that in the forest we have all of those species and that they are all breeding. The little grebe, although lots of reflection here, we do have a number of pairs of little grebes at Cannock Ponds breeding, and also I think at Sudley Ponds. So this year they had a couple of babies, and sometimes you can get close to them. This was a very obliging individual feeding on, I think, little sticklebacks, and you often see them bobbing up and down in amongst the weedy Cannock Ponds. And the Forest of Dean also has one of the largest populations of mandarin ducks in the country, a non-native duck from East Asia, particularly China. They do very well here, and in the autumn time there could be as many as 200 mandarin ducks on some of the ponds, such as Cannock Ponds. Here we've got a female, lovely male and female. The males have just come back into their breeding plumage after looking like females since May as part of their molting plumage. They look like females while they become flightless, so they're less easy to be predated. Here's a beautiful mandarin duck here. And mandarin ducks are interesting that they use holes for nesting in. So we've got an owl box just in the woodland behind us, and sometimes the tawny owls use it, sometimes the stock doves use it, and sometimes the mandarin duck uses it. And a couple of years ago, she laid up to about 10 eggs in the box. They're quite interesting, though, in that they use Cannock Ponds, for example, during the daytime, but as soon as it gets dusk, they take flight and they fly off somewhere else. I don't know where they go. There's a few other ponds nearby that they could go to. They may also be flying up into the trees nearby somewhere to roost as well. They certainly will do that. But interesting ducks to have in the Forest of Dean, and something that people always take a lot of joy in actually seeing. They're more shy than the mallards and the tufted ducks. And if you do sprinkle grain down, they're often the last ones to come and feed when you've moved away. So beautiful mandarin ducks there. Now, one of the very special things about the Forest of Dean, of course, when you have woodland, is that you have lots of woodland birds. And with woodland birds, you have many common species, such as your blackbird, your robin, your wren, your dunnock. And of course, as soon as we get into the new year in January, very slowly but surely, the dawn chorus starts to crank up. And you'd be amazed, even by mid-February at about 6:30 in the morning, there's quite a sound going on outside with the song thrushes, the blackbirds and the robins, maybe not quite the blackbirds then. And this was a photograph I took actually back in the spring. I was recording the dawn chorus. I recorded it on my phone, but I was a bit worried the sound wouldn't quite come out well enough. So I've got another recording, and hopefully you can hear this. Let me just make sure that the volume's up nice and high. It's not booming loud, but this is just outside my back door, basically. And there's lots and lots of different species in there. And it really is a remarkable sound, just hearing so many birds early in the morning when there's not many cars around. We'll come back to some other sounds a little bit later, but what's really lovely is that as we get later into the season, there are a lot of summer migrants that come here and join the local residents, such as the blackbirds and the song thrushes. And I must just add, actually, if you want to see a song thrush, come to the Forest of Dean. We've got an incredibly high density of song thrushes. They do incredibly well here in the Forest of Dean. I've got one place where I take people in the evening where literally just in the young larch and Douglas firs around me, there can be 6, I'm not kidding, 6 song thrushes all singing at the same time. And what's remarkable is that at dusk time, they all sing each other off, and then suddenly it gets dark enough, they just go silent. And suddenly you're left with this amazing silence, apart from the odd owl or woodcock. Really is remarkable. So song thrush is doing very well here. Another bird that is still doing well here in the Forest of Dean, touch wood, is the spotted flycatcher. And certainly in July, August time, wherever you go in the Forest of Dean, you've got a very, very good chance of coming across a family of spotted flycatchers. This year, just outside the back of me, we had several families passing through. I had one in the garden. I don't want to speak too soon, because obviously I realise that nationally across the UK, they have been declining very, very quickly and by a large amount. But I think in the Forest of Dean, you've still got that 40 miles square of woodland joining with the Wye Valley. And I think that that's helping to ensure that there's enough insects life here, there's enough trees and habitat for them here. And anecdotally, it's thought they often associate with goshawks. So often if you've got a goshawk nest, which we go and visit as part of the Gloucestershire Raptor Monitoring Group, you'll often have a pair of spotted flycatchers nearby. And it's often thought that that's often where you've got goshawks, you haven't got sparrowhawks, basically. And so it's a way of the spotted flycatchers being protected. And here's a youngster, a nice fresh youngster, just showing all its kind of spotty plumage a couple of summers ago. Now, a really beautiful but shy bird in the Forestine is the hawfinch. Now, if any of you have had the fortune to go to somewhere like, I don't know, Croatia or Poland, hawfinches are much, much easier to see. I remember being in Croatia and having them just outside the airport in a bit of woodland, literally outside the entrance of the airport. They take a bit more looking for here in the Forestine, listening for their ticking sounds and their squeaky calls. And this is actually a bird that I was helping a guy called Jerry in South Wales to colour ring before being released, and he puts little colour rings on their legs for people to look out for and report. Look at that conking beak, really amazing beak. These nest semi-colonially, very high ups in the trees, very shy birds. But each winter in the Forestine, there are certain places where you can see them. So, for example, there's a big square of yew trees in the middle of Park End, and the hawfinches come down to feed on the seeds of the yew berries, and that could be quite a reliable place for them. But certainly you can come across them. I felt very fortunate I was doing a breeding bird survey just across the road from where I live, and the cherry trees were just coming into fruit back in June, and I could hear the squeaks and the ticks of hawfinch, and there was 2 adults and a juvenile, and they came out into a tree. So I was so pleased to be able to get them on my breeding bird survey, and a couple of days later the juvenile was still around, flying around, so I was really pleased about that. So certainly a good bird. Very often, though, you don't get the views I've just shown you. Very often they're at the top of a tree. You're listening. If you go onto a website, xeno-canto.org, xeno-canto.org, and look up their calls. If you get your ear on those calls, it's a really good way of picking these birds up at the tops of trees. And then if you have binoculars or a scope, you can usually see that lovely black bib, and really kind of, they're a big finch. They're bigger than a green finch, so they're very obvious at the top of a tree. Lots of other birds that we have here. We have lots of crossbills. These are a bird that actually before the coniferous plantations were very rare here in the Forestine. But now, of course, we've got lots of larch and lots of Douglas fir and Norway spruce, etc. And so we have lots of cones for these birds to feed on. Sometimes they come down to pools to drink, but more often than not, you're looking for them going overhead. They've got a I often get them going over the house, and you're listening for a sort of a chip, chip, chip call. And if you do spot them land, they're often at the top of a tree. But one thing that I've never grown up with is the song of the crossbill. And it's an amazing mixture of different squeaks and chirps and things like that. It's quite underwhelming, I guess, in many respects. But equally, the crossbill always looks like a bird that perhaps shouldn't or doesn't sing. And yet you can suddenly hear this amazing sound coming from its beaks. It's rather wonderful. Another bird that we still have in good numbers, very good numbers here in the Forestine, even though it's nationally declining, is the tree pipit. Isn't this a beautiful photograph? Not one of mine, but a beautiful, beautiful photograph of the tree pipit. Much more spotted, almost song thrush-like compared to a meadow pipit. And here in the Forestine, some of the local ringers have actually been putting little tags, little geolocators tags on the tree pipits to find out where they're going during the winter time. So here we can see this tree pipit with this little tag. Of course, the task is then to recapture these birds the following year, but some of them have been recaught. These birds generally tend to winter in parts of West Africa, but have been known to fly as far south as South Africa. And this is certainly part of an ongoing project, not just here in the Forestine, but also, I think, over towards Tetford, closer to the British Trust for Ornithology's headquarters. They're also given colour rings as well, and this is used by Rob Husbands and others to actually be looking out for individuals the following spring, and also to try and detect new birds that are coming onto territory the next year. Another bird that we have lots of here in the Forestine are woodcock. And wherever you go in the Forestine at dusk between March and mid-July, you've got a sure chance of coming across the croaking sound of a roding woodcock. And what they're doing is the male birds particularly are moving around a territory. Sometimes you might get 2 birds chasing each other. And they make some remarkable, I've got some recordings that I've taken from over my house. I'm hoping you can hear this. So again, let me just check that that's on full volume. Let's press play. So I'm not sure if you picked that up. Have another listen. You're listening for like a sort of very gentle croaking sound and then a kind of squeaky twitty. I'll just play it once more. And that's the call of the woodcock. And what I did during the first lockdowns was I put a sound recorder in my back garden at night, and I was trying to record what was going overhead. And it was really fascinating, actually. There was occasionally the moorhen, occasionally coot flying over the house. So you had 2 curlews flying over one night, but very much at dusk and dawn. Even when it was still pretty dark, actually, say 3 in the morning in April, you'd get the woodcock roding overhead doing this croaking and this twisicking sound. But again, good populations of woodcock here in the Forest of Dean. Now, another bird to showcase before I head towards some of the mammals is the pied flycatcher. Again, pied flycatchers do live here in the Forest of Dean, not perhaps in the numbers that they once did, but certainly at the Nag's Head RSPB Reserve, which is probably one of the most well-studied pied flycatcher populations in the country across the UK, where they've been studied since the 1930s. This year we had about 18 pairs or so, but it has been up to 25 in recent years. And back in the 90s, it was over 100 pairs. But some of that is thought to be perhaps to do with almost like the artificialness of having boxes up for them. But anyway, this year we had about sort of 18 pairs or so. They weren't that successful this year because of the weather, but it varies from year to year. Unlike a blue tit and a great tit, they produce a nest with much more grasses and twigs and leaves, much less mossy, and they produce up to 8 or 9 beautiful pale blue eggs. And this year we were ringing some of the chicks and trying to ring some of the adults. We actually had an adult female on a nest who was originally ringed as a chick 4 years ago. So that's brilliant to think that she's been to West Africa and back 4 times and is still breeding at Nag's Head RSPB Reserve. Other birds to feature as well. We have things like the baby tawny owls and lots of those certainly around. Many of those using natural cavities in the trees around the Forest of Dean, but there are also lots of nest boxes up for those around the edge. So I just wanted to put a rather cute baby tawny on there before I go to a few other species. Fast declining nationally, but we do still have wood warblers. And certainly in the middle of the forest this year, I was able to take people on a kind of couple of hours walk and actually clock up 6 or 7, maybe 8 or 9 singing wood warblers, which was pretty good, but not compared to obviously 30 years ago when you know at Nag's Head RSPB Reserve there were over 60 singing males. So we certainly don't have the numbers there were, but they are still here. They are still singing and certainly being monitored as well. So a couple more birds to go. We've got, so I just wanted to feature nightjars. So nightjars certainly do benefit from some of those open areas where you've had some clearfell, for example. Usually when it's a few years old. So we've got a clearfell area outside the back of us. We've been here 6 years now. We've always heard a nightjar from the house, but it's taken 6 or 7 years since that area was clearfelled and replanted to actually get a male nightjar staying and kind of churring throughout the season. And we certainly had a male this year. One thing I wanted to show you actually was how big their mouths are. This is a bird that I was ringing a few years ago, and they look like they've got this tiny little mouth, this tiny little beak, but actually they hoover up moths and different insects, and to do that they have a huge big mouth, and you can see just how big that mouth is, and of course those very big eyes. And something else you may not be aware of as well, if you look at this picture of the toe, you can see that the middle toe there has serrated. It's like a comb, and barn owls have this, as do grey herons and egrets. It's thought to help the nightjar with preening, and probably preening off the scales of moths on its feathers and perhaps other things that it picks up when it's foraging. And they use this, what's called a pectinated claw, to help clean its feathers. Again, all these little things you can't really see it in the photograph here. It is there actually, the lowest claw there, but you can't really see the detail. Another bird as well that features perhaps in the more open areas that we've still got lots of here are also stone chats. Here's a beautiful male stone chat on top of a fir. Here's one, lots of insects around, and a lovely female stone chat. So they certainly are doing well in those open areas and those kind of scrubby areas. One more bird that we do have still here in the Forest of Dean is the cuckoo. And cuckoos have never necessarily been super common here in the Forest of Dean. They've always been quite well spread out at low density, but we certainly do still have them. And this is one that I recorded a couple of years ago just outside my house. Never tire of hearing the cuckoo. And this one I jumped out of bed for at 4 a.m. I suddenly heard it cuckooing. I jumped out of bed, grabbed the sound recorder, ran up the garden, and managed to just capture the sound of it cuckooing in some of the oak trees before it moved off. And it's one of those kind of sounds really that perhaps 50, 60 years ago you would never have thought two minds about. But now, every time I hear the cuckoo, I sort of wonder whether it's going to be the last one I hear from the garden. So I'm always sort of savouring every time I hear a cuckoo now. All right, so we've talked a lot about birds, and of course, where you've got healthy soils, you've got healthy invertebrate populations, where you've got, for example, lots of moth caterpillars, then you're going to have lots of cuckoos because they feed on moth caterpillars. And of course, as you go higher up the food chain, you then get to your herbivores. We don't have any kind of big carnivores, of course, no wolves or lynx or anything like that, but we do have kind of medium-sized carnivores. But we'll focus on some of the omnivores for now, and that's our wild boar. Now in the Forest of Dean, this was the last place that big boar, last existed 600 years ago, and they were hunted out of existence. And the Forest of Dean was the last place in the country where they lived. They were illegally reintroduced about 20 years ago off the back of a lorry at night. We're not sure of the exact story, possibly a farmer who was going into debt or something, needed to get rid of his boar or her boar, we're not quite sure. But nonetheless, about 60 animals, and before that, about 15, 20 animals were released into the forest. And at their peak, there was about just under 2,000 boar about 10 years ago. Forestry England had to get on top of the numbers because there's no natural predators, and they've decided to keep their numbers at about 400, and they're close to that figure now. So they don't want to get rid of the boar. They just, when there was 2,000, there was lots of more human boar conflicts taking place really in the towns and villages with dog walkers, things like that. So they've got their numbers down. But I love wild boar. They're always scared of you. They always run away generally, unless, you know, most habituated boar have been shot. So they're very wild animals, coming out at dusk mainly, and they're very much a woodland engineer, turning over the soil, aerating the soil, stopping it from being compacted. They clear areas where there was lots of dense grasses and brambles and allow new seedlings to come up. And they do it with that nose and their teeth. Their lower teeth are pointing outwards, and so they use their teeth and their nose as a shovel to be able to root around. They're big animals. Sort of body size wise, they're about the size of perhaps a fallow deer, so a reasonable size, but they're on short legs and very short necks. And from a distance, they often look like a small bear, very black haired, very brown haired animals, and often grunting. If they detect you, they'll often run away with a huff type sound. And they go around in a group called a sounder of boar, female led. So you have your matriarch female and then maybe some younger females, and the males tend to go around by themselves or in twos or threes. And often you're coming across the wild boar. They don't really have any patterns to their behavior, so you're often just having to be in the right places and look for them. And they have their young, their boarlets, end of February, March, April. Some younger females might have some boar in June, July. And actually my wife just saw just a few days ago a female with some youngsters which is unusual to have them this late in the year, but they're very stripy for camouflage. And once they're about 3 months old, they become a very orangey brown color. And this is a youngish female. She's a breeding female. This was just along the track from where I live. They've got a very long snout, much more longer snouted than a domestic pig. And they can be incredibly well camouflaged. They can disappear incredibly easily in the undergrowth. Here she is actually coming out. This is a youngish female. She's not big and bulky like one of the photographs I just showed you. She's a youngish female, probably from the previous year, so still growing. And she's coming here just to sort of check me out. And in the grassland habitat, the reason she was just checking me out was because she actually had these 4 boarlets, and she then took them off along the track away. So this time of the year, there's quite a lot of numbers of boar around. They're still tricky to see. I didn't see any tonight, sadly. We saw lots of signs of them, but not any boar to be seen. But certainly they are an animal that's around. You just have to be in the right place for them. But lots of signs of them. They produce poo like this. It almost looks a bit like horse poo, but much smaller, liked, of course, by the dor beetles. And this is the sort of thing that they do in the woodland environment. They do this rootling around, and you wonder what effect it must have on our British woodlands, because all across Europe, you've got wild boar doing this. And we've had them absent from our woodlands across the UK for the last 600 years, really. And you wonder what's not quite happening, or what animals are not benefiting from the boar. Because when you see what they're doing all the time, they're rootling around, they're turning the leaves into the soil, they're aerating it. Here we've got some brambles, and they've pushed the brambles out the way, and they've made some bare soil, which will then turn into foxgloves and other plants. It does make you wonder what's missing out, what ecologically is missing out from not having boar in other woodlands across the country. But this is what they're good at doing, turning over the tufts of grass, which badgers don't tend to do. Badgers are more light touch. Boar really go in there and turn over those tufts of grass and expose the soil and allow new things to grow up. So they're really good at doing this and allowing new growth of the plants and trying to push the bracken and the bramble and the competitive grasses out the way. They're also good for other things as well, because they love a bath. They don't sweat like we do. They have to make themselves wet and muddy, so they develop lots of their own little mud baths or wallows throughout the forest. So they actually build ponds, new ponds in the forest, and that then benefits other wildlife. Birds coming to drink, frog spawn. This was some frog spawn in a boar wallow back in April. I've also seen newt tadpoles in boar wallows in the Forest of Dean. So lots of benefit for all this small stuff that we were talking about at the start of this evening. And in amongst all of this, you get lots of other things growing as well. This is some fantastic fungi going on in this dead log in between where boar have been snuffling around as well. So what about some of the other things that we have from a herbivore perspective? Well, of course, we have deer. We probably have too many deer because, well, many mammals are going down. We've got half the number of foxes and rabbits in the UK that we had 30, 40 years ago. We instead have double or triple the number of roe deer, for example, if not more than that. We certainly do have these two species. The roe deer are native deer, more on the outskirts of the forest. They often go into farmers' fields to graze at night. And we certainly do have the muntjac deer, an introduced species from East Asia, not good for woodlands because they nibble all the kind of ground and herb layer. We see them from time to time. They are here. They're very shy animals, and but one we don't want so much of. But one we do have lots of, perhaps several thousands of these, is the fallow deer. And so actually I saw about 6 or 7 of these this evening when I took some people out. So lots of fallow deer. But in the centre of the forest, you do see their impact. Lots of deer height browsing on holly, oak and beech. They browse the ivy up to the height of fallow deer. So you do see lots of that going on. But on the outskirts of the forest, for example, where I live, you don't see so much deer browsing. You see it on the ivy, but actually the oak trees and the beech trees grow all the way down to the ground and don't get so much browse. So you can often tell where there's high and low densities of these. And these are also non-native. They've been here since the Norman times, so they've been here, you know, many, many hundreds of years. But they're not necessarily, they're not a native deer, but they're certainly the deer that you will see in the middle of the forest if you're going out and about, certainly a few hours before darkness. And one creature that we now have in the Forest of Dean that has come to the Forest of Dean is the pine marten. And this has been reintroduced from Scotland in 2019, and last year we had in total about 40 animals reintroduced into the forest from Scotland. And I've seen them on about 4 occasions now, usually at dusk, crossing a track like a chocolate brown cat. And there's two reasons why they've been reintroduced. One is because the population is coming down from Wales anyway, so it's a way of trying to increase their spread and get them out there. And two, from an ecological perspective. For example, grey squirrels cause a lot of damage to many young trees here in the Forest of Dean, and pine martens love to eat squirrels, particularly young squirrel kits in the nests. And so actually it's trying to help bring even more of a balance here in the Forest of Dean, along with the goshawks and some of the other sort of medium-sized predators. And I'm not going to play it. I haven't got time to play it now, but actually, if you look up moving martin on YouTube or Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust, there's a 15-minute video all about the martins coming down from Scotland down to the Forest of Dean. They show the holding cages they were in, and then footage of them actually coming out of those cages and exploring the woodland. So definitely a video to maybe watch after today's meeting. Now, I want to finish off with a couple of the bigger birds of prey. I'm part of the Gloucestershire Raptor Monitoring Group here in the Forest of Dean, where we particularly monitor birds such as the goshawk. Now, the goshawk is it's still a rare bird really across the UK, but it's certainly increasing in many pockets and many woodlands. And here in the Forest of Dean, we've got about 60 pairs or so. Very shy. These are of Swedish origin, so they're very big birds, but unlike German goshawks, they certainly don't like people and won't come into urban and suburban areas. Beautiful male goshawk here. But at the right time of the year, you can see these birds quite readily in the springtime. I just got a map here from the BTO just showing you the spread. You can see lots of gains of goshawks over the last sort of 30 years or so, particularly around this kind of South Wales, Forest of Dean area. And if you come to the Forest of Dean mid-February to mid-March, end of March, have a nice sunny day, not even always on a sunny day, you'll get goshawks displaying from New Fancy View, from Simmons Yacht Rock, for example, and other places as well. When I take people out to see other wildlife, quite often you'll get the chance view of a goshawk flying overhead. And these are some footage from a friend of mine, Gareth Jones, who's put out camera traps to try and spot these birds. And we put yellow colorings on their legs to try and identify them. And although they don't get spotted by people very often, the camera traps do help to pick up these birds and help us to know who's who, who's gone where, and that sort of thing. Here's another picture of a goshawk here coming in towards a camera trap and some prey. And here's a youngster, a young bird. And what's interesting is that when you get, for those of you that are familiar with goshawks, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. But when you live near crows and buzzards and things like that, particularly crows, you get used to a crow, the alarm call of a crow when there's a buzzard around, which is kind of not that bothered. And then when there's a goshawk around, you get used to the crows, you know to look up. So basically the crow does a much more deliberate, more worried kind of cawing type call than it does if there's a buzzard around or a peregrine or something like that. And you know immediately to look up and look for a goshawk, because crows are much better at spotting goshawks than we are. So crows are a really great way of spotting goshawks here in the Forest of Dean. And I came home one evening, the crows were making a right racket just across the road from me. And I thought, I bet you there's a goshawk. And I found a juvenile just like this one, perched up in a tall tree. And finally, actually, it took off away from the crows. So here's some of the colouring that we do each year. We ring good numbers, tens of these chicks. We work with the we work with professional climbers who go up these trees to collect the chicks and bring them down safely. And as I say, the colouring is not so much for people to spot, but it's to spot through camera traps that are put on different nests throughout the forest. And on a few occasions, we've also worked with the BTO to put tags on the chicks just as they're about to fledge. So this is a young goshawk just about to fledge, being put with a harness on. And so this has been done, I think, with about 10 chicks or so here in the Forest of Dean. And they don't generally move that far. And they certainly move around the forest to different pockets. So here's that particular bird almost ready to go. So we know certainly from ringing these birds that many of them stay quite local. These arrows here just show you a few of the places where they've gone. We did have one bird close to where it says Lydney in the middle here that went all the way over towards Pembrokeshire. And we've certainly had a bird from the New Forest come here to the Forest of Dean. So they do move around. But the tracking of these birds with those tags is still being analysed, really. A lot of these young birds do disappear quite early on, either because of starvation or through persecution still here, certainly on the edges of the Forest of Dean. But we do have birds around, and as I say, they keep very quiet, they go very unseen, but they certainly do move around the forest. So I've got here, oldest goshawk in the UK was ringed in Gloucestershire and found near Lidbrook here in the Forest of Dean 18 years and 8 months later. And actually, I think we had another recent bird that was a similar sort of age. And another one was ringed in a New Forest and found nesting in the Forest of Dean in 2019, 7 years later. We also colour ring peregrines. So traditionally, I've colour ringed peregrines with blue rings in the Bristol region. And here in the Forest of Dean, we put orange rings on these birds. And it's a great way of these guys being spotted by people in this case. So goshawks don't really get spotted by people very much, but peregrines do. So this 3-week-old chick with a big full crop here, often their colourings will get photographed or spotted by people at the nest or on web cameras. And it's a great way of tracking these birds. We've heard from a few of these birds, more urban birds that have been ringed, for example, in Cheltenham and places like that, but we haven't heard from that many of our colour. We don't ring that many in the Forest of Dean, so sample sizes are quite small still at the moment. But there we go. We've got a beautiful peregrine there to show you what the adult looks like. And we don't have many peregrines here in the Forest of Dean. They tend to use quarries where we do have them old, or mainly old disused quarries. And we do have a little bit of birds coming in. So one of the birds, actually one quarry, is a bird that we ringed in Bristol, actually. So it's come across the river from Bristol and breeds as a quarry breeding bird. It originally hatched from a nest on the edge of a railway between Bristol and Bath Railway. So quite an interesting change there. And these are some of the chicks actually in that particular adults that I'm talking about, adult nest there. So just to finish off, really, we started off with all the small stuff. We've gradually made our way up to some of the herbivores and the predators. And just in the last couple of slides, I just want to finish off really. We're going to autumn time now, so we're going to come back down to the soil. And autumn time in the Forest of Dean is a fabulous time to look for fungi. Down here on the bottom left, we've got the amethyst deceiver, this beautiful purple fungus. We've got these ones that look like little kind of candles on the top there. And of course, the deadly one on the bottom right, which I've forgotten the name of, but very beautiful, but very poisonous, but liked by squirrels and voles and things like that. So as we're going into autumn now, the colours are changing, and certainly by early November, the Forest of Dean, instead of being green everywhere, will become an orange and brown yellow forest. It's really remarkable, the transformation that you see. Lots of fungi will pop up everywhere in amongst all that sort of dead and dying leaves and so forth. So it's a great time. And actually now is also a really good time for insects feeding on ivy. So lots of ivy that's on our oak trees, particularly, will be providing important food for some of those late pollinators, and also for the birds, because the birds might all be coming down to feed on some of those insects. And interestingly enough, actually, the berries of the ivy are eaten by birds, often not in the winter time, but the following spring. So the last few springs, in April time, when we've had some poor weather, I've seen blackbirds and song thrushes, even into early May, still feeding on ivy berries, which I think is really interesting. And just to finish off with, really, as we go into autumn time, I've talked about some of the different birds, but one of the seasonal birds we get here in the Forest of Dean is the brambling. And last year, certainly, there was lots and lots and lots and lots of bramblings here in the forest. Who knows what's going to happen this autumn? But the female on the left there, the male on the right, before he's developed his black head where the edges of the feathers wear away. And although the chaffinch is declining nationally now, thought to be linked to disease like the greenfinch, we do still have good numbers of chaffinches here in the Forest of Dean as well. So it's a good place to spot them. So just a few things to finish off for the autumn. So this is the Wye Valley. This is the view from Yap Rock. This is showing you the changes that are going to be happening over the next few weeks or so. And although we've lost the bird song in the forest, there's still some robins singing. There's still raptors like buzzards flying around on sunny days. And of course, lots of roving tit flocks. In amongst them, goldcrests, nuthatches, tree creepers, firecrests. We get lots of here in the Forest of Dean, both in the springtime, but maybe during the winter as well, but certainly during the springtime. And of course, it becomes an easier time to be looking for the deer and the boar and some of these more unusual species. So on that note, I'm going to finish there. I hope there's been an interesting presentation taking you through the different parts of the forest, from the soil to the big animals and then back down to the soil again. And I hope that's given you a greater insight and share really of why the Forest of Dean is a great place for wildlife. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ed. It certainly has been a very interesting talk, and I'm sure it's raised quite a few questions. So if you're happy to take a few questions, we've been very pleased and grateful.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
thank you.
Cool.
It's possible that some of you have submitted questions to Gary through the chat. And so I'll ask Gary in a minute to spell some of those out. If I could just step in with a quick question of my own first, Ed. You mentioned about grazing animals in the forest, and at the beginning suggested that the numbers of sheep had declined and were perhaps at too low a level at the moment. I just wondered whether there are any plans to reintroduce other large herbivores into the forest to aid with habitat management.
Yeah, can you still hear me okay?
Yes.
Just to check, has my screen gone off share or is it stuck?
It's on share, but with all your photographs, images on the left.
Okay. It just seems to have frozen my end, but that's fine. Yeah, so really good question. So although we haven't got so many sheep here now, and the sheep here actually were here because of a traditional, so many people here in the Forest of Dean who have a commoner's right are called sheep badgers. And so many of them were exercising this right to have all these sheep in the Forest of Dean. Many of those now have stopped, certainly since foot and mouth. So that you're right, there is still some conservation grazing going on, and with some sheep. So there was a heritage project called the Forester's Forest Project, and as part of improving areas for wildlife, there was targeted sheep grazing happening in some places. And certainly the Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust has this kind of constant program of moving the cows that I showed you, and also the horses around different parts of the forest. So there is certainly targeted, but there is still a concern from people that because there aren't the sheep anymore and there aren't the rabbits anymore, a lot of those open areas that are important for butterflies and certain plant species are becoming too enclosed. But I don't think there's necessarily a long-term strategy for that across the wider forest. Okay, thanks for that, Ed. Any more questions, either through you, Gary, or directly from members listening?
Martin's got a question.
A couple of questions. Thanks, Ed, for the presentation. It was truly fascinating. Can I just ask, one of the birds you didn't mention was Leicester Spotted Woodpecker.
Yes.
I've got in the back of my mind that Park End is probably then a location for those. So that's one question. And I suppose the other question, just about the birds, you mentioned the goshawks were Swedish rather than German. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about the history, I suppose, or how you come to that determination.
Okay. Ed, I think we might have lost you.
I'm going to try and get hold of Ed, but I wonder if you might mention about the membership while I do that, Nigel.
Yes, I can do that. Well, whilst Kathy's trying to relocate Ed in the ether, I'll just mention about membership. And we really hope, as some of you already done, that you'll consider joining Bangerbird Group for the year, thereby enjoying the full program of over 20.
I'm back.
Oh, great. Oh, great.
Sorry, it froze and then gave up.
Yeah.
Sorry, thanks for your question. Sorry, I just got the end. You were talking about Leicester Spotted Woodpecker.
The second part of the question was, when you were speaking about goshawks, you referred to them as Swedish goshawks.
Yeah.
had a distinction between German goshawks. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about how you come to that determination.
Yes, okay, sure. So with lesser spotted woodpeckers, so we do still have lesser spotted woodpeckers here, and obviously I didn't talk about firecrests either, particularly either, just because of time. But so like the national trend, lesser spotted woodpeckers have declined here in the Forest of Dean. There certainly aren't the numbers there used to be, and they are difficult to find. But we do still have them here. There are still the woodlands with the kind of the sort of wood and some of the damp woody areas that they can use in the wintertime for them. And also they often need orchards in the winter as well in many places. And we, on the edge of the Forest of Dean, there are still some quite traditional orchards where some of them might well go in winter as well. But they are blooming difficult to find. I was very lucky enough to see a male drumming this year. I was taken to a secret site by a local ornithologist to see them, but they are really, really difficult to see. And you know, they are still around Nag's Head RSPB Reserve, for example, but I think because they're here in lower density, they don't need to call in the way that they would have done 30, 40 years ago, because there's not other male rival birds around for them to call at, really. And in terms of goshawks, so it's to do with size. And we've had a few problems here in the Forest of Dean with the rings. We have to try and we have to use bigger rings here in the Forest of Dean because the leg size of the goshawks is very big. So I've not done the work myself, but I'm told by other people that have worked with raptors here in the Forest of Dean for the last 30 years or so, that the origins of the goshawk here, because they're thought to come originally from captivity and falconry birds, are thought to be more from this larger kind of subpopulation of Scandinavian goshawks. And you know, it's like hawfinches really in kind of Poland and Hungary really, where they tend to be much more obliging birds than the hawfinches are in this country. And you know, you get different subspecies and things. So the subspecies, you know, the goshawks that live in Germany for some reason seem to be much more able to deal with being in an urban suburban area than our goshawks are. But I don't, to be honest, really, I can't answer any more detail on that, I'm afraid. I'm just being told by those who, you know, have worked closely with the goshawks here in the forest over the last 30, 40 years that they think, I don't know whether they've done any genetics, but certainly by the size of the legs and everything and the measurements of the legs, because often you can determine where different species of birds like dunlin, for example, as well as other raptors come from, often by their leg sizes. And the tarsi size, so the main leg of the goshawk seems to be very thick here in the Forest of Dean, and that seems to measure up well with birds that would come from somewhere like Finland, basically.
Thank you.
Thanks for that answer. Any more questions? Gary, do you have any more?
We've not got any in the chat, but we
Yep.
have a thank you, Ed. That was excellent from Kate.
Oh, my pleasure.
Good, good.
So, sorry, Nigel, can I ask another question?
Of course, carry on.
Hog it. One of the questions that I quite frequently ask, because it comes up during the course of discussions with speakers, is the extent of actually climatic change, how visible it is for people who actually live in a particular community and work in that community. You know, you've mentioned that there's a 100-year plan, which may be all well and good, but the environment is moving a lot quicker at times. I just wondered if you know, your personal observations about living in the forest and what you've noticed, and any concerns that might be bringing to the surface.
Yes, it's a really good question. And actually the head of the Forestry England here in the Forest of Dean did an amazing presentation about the forest and changing climate over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And Forestry England have got access to some amazing data that shows them how the climate of the forest in about 30, 40 years time will be like that, or certainly by the end of the century will be like that of southern France at the moment. So there's some really interesting, and northern Spain. So there's some really interesting information that Forestry England certainly is working with. And they are planting new trees, different types of trees. For example, I always want to say hickory smoked ribs. It's something hickory from North America.
Yeah.
I can't remember the name of it, but there's a North American tree species that they're trialing planting here in the Forest of Dean because they feel that will deal better with a warming, drier climate. And so they're looking much more at this sort of thing. from my perspective as someone who lives here, there's certainly the forest is drying out. I mean, when I took some people out tonight, it's still, despite the rain we've had, it's still incredibly dry. The bore wallows are dry. The streams that should normally be running are dry, and that sort of stuff. Some of the drying out of the forest isn't necessarily climate related. Some of it's because there are some very deep historic mines in the forest that drain a lot of water out of the woodland. So some of it is to do with that. Certainly when the head of Forestry England was talking to us back in July, he showed photographs of oak trees that are suffering. I mean, oak trees don't like their feet too wet, and they don't like their feet too dry, basically. So his feeling is, or I think the model indications are, that certainly many of our oak trees here in the Forest Inn are going to suffer. They're going to stress. So they're not necessarily all going to die off suddenly and be gone in 100 years, but there's certainly evidence already that the oak trees are stressing, are getting stressed. Now, from their perspective, they're looking at the potential of the genetics of oak trees that perhaps are doing already very well in southern France and Spain, and then potentially looking at, you know, perhaps using that genetic stock in new planting areas here in the Forest of Dean. So it's very serious in respect of how Forestry England is looking at how their planting is going to change over the next decade or so. But I think from my perspective of what I'm seeing, it's more the short-term weather. So it's the fact that we've had this drought this year, and it's still an ongoing kind of drought conditions. And so, you know, the forest is definitely dry at the moment, and definitely water bodies are definitely lower in water and that sort of stuff. But I think the long-term effects are still playing out, if that makes sense. One thing we do still have here is the willow warbler. So you may know that the research is showing that the willow warbler is declining from areas that are increasing in temperature, and certainly have been lost from a lot of lowland areas of southern England. I'm sure it will happen here in the Forest of Dean in the end, but because we're sort of between 150 and 200 meters above sea level, we do still have the willow warbler. So I'm very pleased about that, because I love the willow warbler and its song, you know. But it's certainly an indicator to me that obviously the climate here in the Forest of Dean is still cool enough for it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed. Time for one more quick question from anybody.
Feel free to unmute if you wish.
Ed, thank you very much for a great talk. Really enjoyed it. Fantastic. How easy is it to see wild boar?
So it was easier 3 years ago. But as I mentioned, Forestry England do cull the deer and the boar because there's no natural predators here, and the meat goes into the national food, you know, restaurants and things like that. Because of that, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, because actually the problem if you have too high a density of deer is they tend to reroot everything and don't give new plants a chance to come up, all that sort of stuff, and they come into conflict more with people. When they're culled, they tend to maintain a more natural behavior of being nocturnal and quite shy and things like that. So how easy? Well, I mean, 3 years ago when I was taking people out, you could see boar 8 to 9 times out of 10 times you went out. Now it's about 1-2 times out of 10. So the probability of seeing them has gone right down. But whereas deer has gone up because they've been shooting the boar and not shooting the deer so much. So the probability of seeing deer has gone right up. So it's not high, Stephen, but you know, wherever you go in the forest, you'll see lots of signs of them. And if you're certainly here for a weekend and you're going out sort of early morning at dusk time, you've certainly got a good chance of bumping into them, I would say.
Okay, thank you.
Not a guaranteed chance, not a high chance, but a good chance, yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Oh, many thanks, Ed, for your detailed answers there. Much appreciated. And before I thank you more fully, I just mentioned a couple of things. I've made an error already. I said that Bangor Bird Group was thought to be the oldest bird group, university bird group in Britain. Julian Hughes put me right. Thanks, Julian. Apparently, Cambridge beat us. They started in 1925. But there we are. We might be second and still very creditable. And secondly, and I was just mentioning it before we regained your connection about membership, if you've enjoyed tonight, and who couldn't, and fancy at least 20 more of the same enjoyable evenings, then please consider joining Bangor Bird Group. It's £20 a year, which works out at £1 an evening, which seems to me pretty good value. And if possible, we'd like you to join buybacks. If you're not able to do that or struggling, please get in touch with us by email and we'll explain alternatives or help you with that. But membership is just as important to us now as it previously was when we had traditional meetings. And looking ahead to the future, when we resume traditional meetings, we will be paying considerably more, it's felt, for our lecture room facilities. So your membership is really much appreciated. And remember, you can still pay as you go, as it were, and the suggested charge for that is £4 a talk, and that can also be given over via backs. So, well, Ed, that was wonderful. As several of the questioners have already said, it was such a well-constructed talk for a start. It was just so varied. I mean, full of varied natural history, and all the time your wonderful ecological insight and enthusiasm. That made for a really good talk. I like the way you started off with the physiography of the place, because it's away from us, and many of us like me don't know the layout. The plant life, always good to hear about, because that's the basis of everything, as I keep telling everybody. The insects and other invertebrates, the amphibia, reptiles and mammals, all clearly have such an important part to play ecologically, and are all attractive groups in their own right. You could hardly go to the Forest of Dean and not be impressed by one or more of those groups. And then your detailed coverage of birds, which I'm sure was really particularly appreciated this evening. It was really good to hear upbeat commentary from you about so many species. I mean, things that we all sort of die for to see, like hawfinch and nightjar. Also the song thrush, great to hear that it's doing so well. Spot flies, I like that link with goshawks, didn't know about that, that was great. And then crossbills and tree pivets. Really was pleased to see how the work of birdringers like yourself is adding to our knowledge there, and the schemes that you outlined seem so worthwhile, as well as giving these glorious opportunities of close inspection of the birds and your wonderful images which complemented the talk throughout. They really are so important these days to get the proper science behind the conservation efforts that you very ably described. So thank you for promoting ringing in that sense, and its continued importance, and the new methodology with trackers as well. And obviously the raptor monitoring group sounds very strong down there, and every strength to that, because it's doing such good work. So much else I made notes about, but basically you're such a wonderful advocate and champion for the Forest of Dean, and such a good presenter. I think we'd all agree that was just a memorable lecture, because it was so entertaining, so informative, and you have such an easy style to listen to on an evening here at home for us. What more enjoyable way of spending an evening. As I've said on previous occasions, one of the joys of the group is having exemplary speakers like yourself, the entertainment it provides nowadays in our sitting room, and the enlightenment that we gain, and that focused look at, in this case, the Forest of Dean, to be repeated, I'm sure, by other speakers over the coming few months with their own topics. But you've set us off on a flying start. So thank you ever so much on behalf of us all. We really did appreciate your contribution. Thank you, Ed.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
It's a shame you can't hear